The Ultimate Fighting Championship is the largest mixed martial arts promotion company in the world, which hosts all of the top-ranked fighters in the sport and produces events worldwide. Based in the United States, the UFC has 9 weight divisions and enforces the unified rules of mixed martial arts. The UFC has held over 250 events. Dana White serves as the president of the UFC while brothers Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta control the UFC's parent company, Zuffa, LLC. The first UFC event was held on November 12, 1993 in Denver, Colorado. The purpose of the event was to identify the most effective martial art in a real fight between competitors of different fighting disciplines, including boxing, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Sambo, wrestling, Muay Thai, karate, judo, and other styles. In subsequent competitions, fighters began adopting effective techniques from more than one discipline, which indirectly helped create an entirely separate style of fighting known as present-day mixed martial arts. With a TV deal and expansion into Canada, Europe, Australia, the Middle East, Asia and new markets within the United States, the UFC as of 2011 has gained in popularity, along with greater mainstream media coverage. As of 2011, viewers can access UFC programming on pay-per-view television in the US, Brazil, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and Italy. UFC programming can also be found on Fox, Fox Sports 1 and Fox Sports 2 in the US, on BT Sport in the United Kingdom and Ireland, as well as in 150 countries in 22 different languages worldwide. UFC programming is shown in 130 countries worldwide, and the UFC plans to continue expanding internationally, running shows regularly in Canada, Brazil and the UK, with an office established in the UK aimed to expand the European audience. The UFC has also bought and absorbed rival promotions Pride, World Extreme Fighting as well as Strikeforce and Elite XC. History. Early competition Early 1990s. Art Davie proposed to John Milius and Rory and Gracie an 8-man single elimination tournament called War of the Worlds. The tournament was inspired by the Gracies in Action video series produced by the Gracie family of Brazil, which featured Gracie Jiu-Jitsu students defeating martial arts masters of various disciplines such as karate, kung fu and kickboxing. The tournament would feature martial artists from different disciplines facing each other in no-holds-barred combat to determine the best martial art and would aim to replicate the excitement of the matches Davie had seen on the videos. John Milius, a noted film director and screenwriter, as well as a Gracie student, agreed to act as the event's creative director. Davie drafted the business plan and 28 investors contributed the initial capital to start WOW Promotions with the intent to develop the tournament into a television franchise. In 1993 WOW Promotions sought a television partner and approached pay-per-view producers TVKO, Sut and Campbell McLaren at the Semaphore Entertainment Group. Both TVKO and Sut declined, but Sega a pioneer in pay-per-view television which had produced such offbeat events as a gender tennis match between Jimmy Connors and Martina Navratilova became WOW's partner in May 1993. SEG contacted video and film art director Jason Cusson to design the trademarked octagon, a signature piece for the event. Cusson remained the production designer through UFC 27. SEG devised the name for the show as the Ultimate Fighting Championship. WOW Promotions and SEG produced the first event, later called UFC 1, at McNichols Sports Arena in Denver, Colorado on November 12, 1993. Art Davie functioned as the show's booker and matchmaker. The show proposed to find an answer for sports fans' questions such as, can a wrestler beat a boxer? As with most martial arts at the time, fighters typically had skills in just one discipline and had little experience against opponents with different skills. The television broadcast featured kickboxers Patrick Smith and Kevin Rosier, Savate fighter Gerard Gordia, karate expert Zane Frazier, shoot fighter Ken Shamrock, sumo wrestler Tila Tulai, boxer Art Jamerson and 175 lb Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt Royce Gracie younger brother of UFC co-founder Rorion, whom Rorion handpicked to represent his family in the competition. Royce Gracie's submission skills proved the most effective in the inaugural tournament, earning him the first ever UFC tournament championship after submitting Jimerson, Shamrock and Gordia in succession. The show proved extremely successful with 86,592 television subscribers on pay-per-view. However, the promoters did not intend for the event to become a precursor to a series. That show was only supposed to be a one-off, eventual UFC president Dana White said. It did so well on pay-per-view they decided to do another, and another. Never in a million years did these guys think they were creating a sport. With no weight classes, fighters often face significantly larger or taller opponents. Keith the Giant Killer Hackney faced Emmanuel Yarborough at UFC 3 with a 9er in height and 400 pounds weight disadvantage. Many martial artists believe that technique could overcome these size disadvantages, and that a skilled fighter could use an opponent's size and strength against him. With the 175 lb Royce Gracie winning 3 of the first 4 events, the UFC quickly proved that size does not always determine the outcome of the fight. During this early part of the organization, the UFC would showcase a bevy of different styles and fighters. Aside from the aforementioned Royce Gracie, Ken Shamrock and Patrick Smith, the competitions also featured competitors such as Hall of Famer Dan Severn, Marco Ruiz, Gary Goodridge, Don Frye, Kimo Leopoldo, Oleg Taktarov and Tank Abbott. Although the first events were dominated by Jiu-Jitsu, other fighting styles became successful, first wrestling, then ground and pound, kickboxing, boxing, and dirty boxing, which eventually melded into modern mixed martial arts. In April 1995, following UFC 5 in Charlotte, North Carolina, Davey and Gracie sold their interest in the franchise to SEG and disbanded WOW Promotions. Davey continued with SEG as the show's booker and matchmaker, as well as the commissioner of Ultimate Fighting, until December 1997. Emergence of stricter rules. Although UFC used the tagline "There are no rules," in the early 1990s, the UFC did in fact operate with limited rules. It banned biting and eye gouging, and frowned on techniques such as hair pulling, head-butting, groin strikes and fish hooking. In fact, in a UFC 4 qualifying match, competitors Jason Fenn and Guy Mezger agreed not to pull hair as they both wore ponytails tied back for the match. Additionally, that same event saw a match-up between Keith Hackney and Joe Sun in which Hackney unleashed a series of groin shots against Sun while on the ground. The UFC had a reputation, especially in the early days, as an extremely violent event, as evidenced by a disclaimer in the beginning of the UFC 5 broadcast which warned audiences of the violent nature of the sport. UFC 5 also introduced the first singles match, a rematch from the inaugural UFC featuring 3-time champion Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock, called the Super Fight. This proved an important development, because singles matches would feature fighters who suffered no prior damage from a previous fight in the same event, unlike tournament matches. Singles matches would become a staple in the UFC for years to come. The Super Fight began as a non-tournament match that would determine the first reigning UFC champion for tournament winners to face. It later evolved into a match that could feature either title matches or non-title matches. The Super Fight would eventually completely phase out tournament matches. By UFC Brazil, the UFC abandoned the tournament format for an entire card of singles matches. UFC 6 was the first event to feature the crowning of the first non-tournament UFC champion, Ken Shamrock. Controversy and reform. Late 1990s, the violent nature of the burgeoning sport quickly drew the attention of the U.S. authorities. Senator John McCain saw a tape of the first UFC events and immediately found it abhorrent. McCain himself led a campaign to ban UFC, calling it human cockfighting, and sending letters to the governors of all 50 U.S. states asking them to ban the event. 36 states enacted laws that ban no-hold-barred fighting, including New York, which enacted the ban on the eve of UFC 12, forcing a relocation of the event to Dothan, Alabama. The UFC continued to air on DirecTV, though its audience remained minuscule compared to the larger cable pay-per-view platforms of the era. In response to the criticism, the UFC increased cooperation with state athletic commissions and redesigned its rules to remove the less palatable elements of fights while retaining the core elements of striking and grappling. UFC 12 saw the introduction of weight classes and the banning of fish hooking. For UFC 14, gloves became mandatory, while kicks to the head of a downed opponent were banned. UFC 15 saw limitations on hair pulling, and the banning of strikes to the back of the neck and head, headbutting, small joint manipulations, and groin strikes. With 5-minute rounds introduced at UFC 21, the UFC gradually rebranded itself as a sport rather than a spectacle. Led by UFC Commissioner Jeff Blatnick and referee John McCarthy, the UFC continued to work with state athletic commissions. Blatnick, McCarthy and matchmaker Joe Silva created a manual of policies, procedures, codes of conduct and rules to help in getting the UFC sanctioned by the athletic commissions, many of which exist to this day. Blatnick and McCarthy traveled around the country, educating regulators and changing perceptions about a sport that was thought to be bloodthirsty and inhumane. By April 2000, their movement had clearly made an impact. California was set to become the first state in the U.S. to sign off on a set of codified rules that governed MMA. Soon after, New Jersey adopted the language. As the UFC continued to work with the athletic commissions, events took place in smaller U.S. markets and venues, such as the Lake Charles Civic Center. The markets included places more in the South, such as Iowa, Mississippi, Louisiana, Wyoming and Alabama. SEG could not secure home video releases for UFC 23 through UFC 29. With other mixed martial arts promotions working towards U.S. sanctioning, the International Fighting Championships secured the first U.S.-sanctioned mixed martial arts event, which occurred in New Jersey on September 30, 2000. Just 2 months later, the UFC held its first sanctioned event, UFC 28, under the New Jersey State Athletic Control Board's unified rules. As the UFC's rules started to evolve, so too did its field of competitors. Notable UFC fighters to emerge in this era include Hall of Famers Mark Coleman, Randy Couture, Chuck Liddell, Matt Hughes and Tito Ortiz, as well as notables Vitor Belfort, Mark Kerr, Pedro Rizzo, Murilo Bustamante, Pat Miletich, Frank Shamrock, Mikey Burnett, Jeremy Horn, Pete Williams, Jens Pulver, Evan Tanner, Andrei Arlovski and Wanderlei Silva, among others. The Zuffa era early 2000s, Zuffa LLC bought UFC in 2001. After the long battle to secure sanctioning, SEG stood on the brink of bankruptcy when Station Casino's executives Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta and their business partner Dana White approached them in 2000, with an offer to purchase the UFC. A month later, in January 2001, the Fertittas bought the UFC for $2 million and created Zuffa, LLC as the parent entity controlling the UFC. I had my attorneys tell me that I was crazy because I wasn't buying anything. I was paying $2 a million and they were saying, "What are you getting?" Lorenzo Fertitta revealed to Fighters Only magazine, recalling the lack of assets he acquired in the purchase. And I said, "What you don't understand is I'm getting the most valuable thing that I could possibly have, which is those 3 letters, UFC. That is what's going to make this thing work." Everybody knows that brand, whether they like it or they don't like it, they react to it. With ties to the Nevada State Athletic Commission, Zuffa secured sanctioning in Nevada in 2001. Shortly thereafter, the UFC returned to pay-per-view cable television with UFC 33 featuring 3 championship bouts. Struggle for survival and turnaround, the UFC slowly, but steadily, rose in popularity after the Zuffa purchase, due partly to greater advertising, corporate sponsorship, the return to cable pay-per-view and subsequent home video and DVD releases. With larger live gates at casino venues like the Trump Taj Mahal and the MGM Grand Garden Arena, the UFC secured its first television deal with Fox Sports Net. The Best Damn Sports Show period aired the first mixed martial arts match on American cable television in June 2002, as well as the main event showcasing Chuck Liddell vs. Vitor Belfort at UFC 37.5. Later, FSN would air highlight shows from the UFC, featuring one-hour blocks of the UFC's greatest bouts. UFC 40 proved to be the most critical event to date in the Zuffa era. The event sold out the MGM Grand Arena and sold 150,000 pay-per-view buys, a rate over 3 times larger than the previous Zuffa events. The event featured a card headlined by a highly anticipated championship grudge match between then-current UFC light heavyweight champion Tito Ortiz and former UFC superfight champion Ken Shamrock, who had previously defected to professional wrestling in the WWE before returning to MMA. It was the first time the UFC hit such a high mark since being forced underground in 1997. UFC 40 also garnered mainstream attention from massive media outlets such as ESPN and USA Today, something that was unfathomable for mixed martial arts at that point in time. Many have suggested that the success of UFC 40 and the anticipation for Ortiz vs Shamrock saved the UFC from bankruptcy. The view rates of the previous Zuffa shows averaged a mere 45,000 buys per event and the company was suffering deep monetary losses. The success of UFC 40 provided a glimmer of hope for the UFC and kept alive the hope that mixed martial arts could become big. Longtime UFC referee Big John McCarthy said that he felt UFC 40 was the turning point in whether or not the sport of MMA would survive in America. Despite the success of UFC 40, the UFC was still experiencing financial deficits. By 2004, Zuffa had $34 million of losses since they purchased the UFC. Fighters who came into prominence after Zuffa's takeover include Anderson Silva, Georges St. Pierre, Rich Franklin, B.J. Penn, Sean Sherk, Matt Serra, Rico Rodriguez, Robbie Lawler, Frank Mir, Karo Payan and Nick Diaz. The Ultimate Fighter and mainstream emergence, faced with the prospect of folding, the UFC stepped outside the bounds of pay-per-view and made a foray into television. After being featured in a reality television series, American Casino, and seeing how well the series worked as a promotion vehicle, the Fertitta brothers developed the idea of the UFC having its own reality series. Their idea, The Ultimate Fighter, a reality television show featuring up-and-coming MMA fighters in competition for a six-figure UFC contract, with fighters eliminated from competition via exhibition mixed martial arts matches, was pitched to several networks, each one rejecting the idea outright. Not until they approached Spike TV, with an offer to pay the $10 million production costs themselves, did they find an outlet. In January 2005, Spike TV launched TUF in the time slot following WWE Raw. The show became an instant success, culminating with a notable season finale brawl featuring finalists Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bunner going toe-to-toe for the right to earn the six-figure contract, an event that Dana White credits for saving the UFC. On the heels of the Griffin-Bunner finale, a second season of The Ultimate Fighter launched in August 2005, and 2 more seasons appeared in 2006. Spike and the UFC continued to create and air new seasons until the show moved to FX in 2012. Following the success of The Ultimate Fighter, Spike also picked up UFC Unleashed, an hour-long weekly show featuring select fights from previous events. Spike also signed on to broadcast live UFC Fight Night, a series of fight events debuting in August 2005, and countdown specials to promote upcoming UFC pay-per-view cards. After a very successful run on Spike and with the upcoming announcement of the UFC's new relationship with Fox, Spike officials made a statement regarding the end of their partnership with the UFC, The Ultimate Fighter Season 14 in September will be our last. Our 6-year partnership with the UFC has been incredibly beneficial in building both our brands, and we wish them all the best in the future. With the announcement of UFC's partnership with Fox in August 2011, The Ultimate Fighter, which entered its 14th season in that September, has moved to the FX network and air on Friday nights starting with Season 15 in the spring of 2012. The new format took the show in a completely different direction, which included fighters being on the Ultimate Fighter unregistered trademark for 13 weeks total, with each elimination fight airing live on FX on Friday nights. Surging popularity and growth. The mid-2000s. With increased visibility, the UFC's pay-per-view buy numbers exploded. UFC 52, the first event after the first season of The Ultimate Fighter featuring eventual UFC Hall of Famer Chuck the Iceman Liddell avenging his defeat to fellow eventual Hall of Famer Randy Couture, drew a pay-per-view audience of 300,000, doubling its previous benchmark of 150,000 set at UFC 40. Following the second season of The Ultimate Fighter, the UFC's much-hyped rubber match between Liddell and Couture drew an estimated 410,000 pay-per-view buys at UFC 57. For the rest of 2006, pay-per-view buy rates continued to skyrocket, with 620,000 buys for UFC 60, Hughes vs Gracie featuring Royce Gracie's first UFC fight in 11 years and 775,000 buys for UFC 61 featuring the highly anticipated rematch between Ken Shamrock and Tito Ortiz, the coaches of The Ultimate Fighter 3. The organization hit a milestone with UFC 66, pitting Ortiz in a rematch against Liddell with over 1 million buys. The surge in popularity prompted the UFC to beef up its executive team. In March 2006, the UFC announced that it had hired Mark Ratner, former executive director of the Nevada Athletic Commission, as vice president of regulatory affairs. Ratner, once an ally of Senator McCain's campaign against no-holds-barred fighting, became a catalyst for the emergence of sanctioned mixed martial arts in the United States. Ratner continues to educate numerous athletic commissions to help raise the UFC's media profile in an attempt to legalize mixed martial arts in jurisdictions inside and outside the United States that have yet to sanction the sport. In December 2006, Zuffa acquired the Northern California-based promotion World Extreme Fighting in order to stop the International Fight League from making a deal with Versus. At the time, the UFC had an exclusive deal with Spike, so the purchase of the WEC allowed Zuffa to block the IFL from Versus without violating their contract. The WEC showcased lighter weight classes in MMA, whereas the UFC featured heavier weight classes. Notable WEC fighters included Uriah Faber, Jamie Varner, Carlos Condit, Ben Henderson, Donald Cerrone, Anthony Pettis, Eddie Wineland, Miguel Angel Torres, Mike Thomas Brown, Leonard Garcia, Brian Bowles, Dominic Cruz and Jose Copyright Aldo. In December 2006, Zuffa also acquired their crosstown, Las Vegas rival World Fighting Alliance. In acquiring the WFA, they acquired the contracts of notable fighters including Quinton Jackson, Lyoto Machida and Martin Kampmann. The sport's popularity was also noticed by the sports betting community as BowDogLife.com, an online gambling site, stated in July 2007 that in 2007 UFC would surpass boxing for the first time in terms of betting revenues. In fact, the UFC had already broken the pay-per-view industry's all-time records for a single year of business, generating over $222,766,000 in revenue in 2006, surpassing both WWE and boxing. The UFC continued its rapid rise from near obscurity with Roger Whittaker gracing the cover of Sports Illustrated and Chuck Liddell on the front of ESPN the magazine in May 2007. Pride acquisition and integration. On March 27, 2007, the UFC and their Japan-based rival the Pride Fighting Championships announced an agreement in which the majority owners of the UFC, Frank and Lorenzo Fertitta, would purchase the Pride brand. Initial intentions were for both organizations to be run separately but aligned together with plans to co-promote cards featuring the champions and top contenders from both organizations. However, after purchasing Pride, Dana White felt that the Pride model was not sustainable and the organization would likely fold, with many former Pride fighters such as Antonio Rodrigo Minotauro Nogueira, Mauricio Shogun Rua, Dan Henderson, Mirko Cro Cop Filipovia, Wanderlei Silva and others already being realigned under the UFC brand. On October 4, 2007, Pride Worldwide closed its Japanese office, laying off 20 people who were working there since the closing of its parent company Dream Stage Entertainment. On June 18, 2008, Lorenzo Fertitta accommodated the UFC's growth by announcing his resignation from Station Casinos in order to devote his energies to the international business development of Zuffa, particularly the UFC. The move proved to be pivotal, as Fertitta helped strike TV deals in China, France, Mexico and Germany, as well as open alternative revenue streams with the new UFC video game and UFC action figures, among other projects. Fighters exposed to the UFC audience Euro, or who became prominently Euro in the post-Pride era include Anderson Silva, John Fitch, Lyoto Machida, Cain Velasquez and John Jones, among others. UFC 100. The Euro late 2000s present, popularity took another major surge in 2009 with UFC 100 and the 10 events preceding it including UFC 90, 91, 92, 94 and 98. UFC 100 was a massive success, garnering 1.7 million buys under the drawing power of former NCAA wrestling champion and current WWE superstar Brock Lesnar and his rematch with former UFC heavyweight champion Frank Mir, Canadian superstar Georges St-Pierre going head-to-head with Brazilian knockout artist Thiago Alves, and Pride legend Dan Henderson opposing British middleweight Michael Bisping. Rival coaches on The Ultimate Fighter, United States vs. United Kingdom. UFC 100 was unique in that it drew significant interest from ESPN, which provided extensive coverage of the event in the days preceding and following it. In fact, ESPN would eventually devote additional coverage of the UFC and other MMA news with the television debut of MMA Live on ESPN2 in May 2010. The buzz from UFC 100 was hampered significantly in the second half of 2009 after a rash of injuries and other health-related issues including Brock Lesnar's life-threatening bout with diverticulitis forcing the organization to continuously scramble and reshuffle its lineup for several events. However, the momentum gradually began to pick up in the first quarter of 2010 after victories from defending champions Georges St-Pierre and Anderson Silva, as well as Lyoto Machida's first career defeat to Shogun Rua for the UFC light heavyweight title. These fights egged into a very popular clash between former UFC champions and rivals Rashad Evans and Quinton Jackson, rival coaches on The Ultimate Fighter 10, heavyweights at UFC 114, featuring the UFC's first main event headlined by African-American fighters. The event scored over 1 million pay-per-view buys as Evans secured a unanimous decision victory. This momentum carried into the summer of 2010 at UFC 116, which featured the return of Brock Lesnar defending his UFC heavyweight title against the undefeated interim champion Shane Carwin before 1.25 million PPV viewers. Lesnar survived an early barrage of Carwin's punches in a contest that was nearly stopped by referee Josh Rosenthal. However, Lesnar recovered in the second round to submit Carwin via an arm triangle choke to retain the undisputed UFC heavyweight championship. The event as a whole was critically acclaimed in the media for living up to the hype with a number of exciting fights that were featured on the televised card. After a dramatic fifth round, last-minute victory by UFC middleweight champion Anderson Silva over Chael Sonnen at UFC 117, Lesnar finally surrendered his belt to the undefeated Cain Velasquez via first-round TKO at UFC 121. The fight produced Velasquez's 8th knockout or technical knockout in his first 9 MMA fights. UFC 129 featured Georges St-Pierre vs Jake Shields at the Rogers Centre in Toronto, Ontario, Canada and is currently the largest UFC event in North American history, which coincided with a 2-day UFC Fan Expo at the Direct Energy Center. The event sold out 55,000 tickets for gate revenues exceeding $11 a million, shattering previous MMA attendance and gate records in North America. TRT. On February 27, 2014, the Nevada State Athletic Commission banned the use of testosterone replacement therapy. The UFC followed suit and banned the use of TRT for any of their events, including international markets where the UFC oversees regulatory efforts. WEC merger. Zuffa, the parent company of the UFC, purchased World Extreme Cardioiting in late 2006 and held the first WEC event under new ownership on January 20, 2007. Soon thereafter the WEC made its home on the Versus Network with its first event debuting on Versus in June 2007. On October 28, 2010, Zuffa announced that its sister promotion, WEC, would merge with the UFC. The WEC held its final card on December 16, 2010. As a result of the merger, the UFC absorbed WEC's bantamweight, featherweight and lightweight weight divisions and their respective fighters. The UFC also made the last WEC featherweight and bantamweight champions, Jose Copyright Aldo and Dominic Cruz respectively, the inaugural UFC champions of their new weight divisions. Reed Harris, who started World Extreme Cardioiting with Scott Adams, had mixed emotions on the merger. A OEITA unregistered trademark is kind of like when your kid goes off to college, at first you're unregistered trademark not happy, but after you think about it for a while, you're unregistered trademark really happy, Harris told MyWeekly.com in an exclusive interview immediately following the announcement. OE at the end of the day, I never imagined this thing would be where we unregistered trademark at today. Unregistered trademark I'm extremely proud and happy that I was involved with something that will now be part of what may be, someday, the largest sports organization in the world. Strikeforce purchase. On March 12, 2011, Dana White revealed that Zuffa had purchased Strikeforce. White went on to explain that Strikeforce will operate as an independent promotion, and that Scott Coker will continue to run the promotion. Strikeforce CEO Scott Coker announced the return of Fedor Emelianenko on an unspecified July or August event and said that Zuffa-owned company would continue to co-promote with M1 Global. Following the purchase, the UFC signed many of Strikeforce's top stars and champions, such as Andrew Fox, Jason Miller, Nick Diaz, Dan Henderson, Alistair Overeem, and Kung La. Under Zuffa's ownership, Strikeforce made minor changes, including adopting the unified rules of mixed martial arts in full, closing the promotion's men's weight classes below lightweight, and ceasing promotion of amateur undercard bouts. After an extension was reached to continue Strikeforce through 2012, the promotion's heavyweight division was merged into the UFC, and the promotion's Challengers Series was ended. The final Strikeforce show was Strikeforce, Marquardt vs. Safayeddin on January 12, 2013, after which the promotion was dissolved and all fighter contracts were either ended or absorbed into the UFC. Fox Partnership. On August 18, 2011, the Ultimate Fighting Championship and Fox announced a 7-year broadcast deal through the Fox Sports subsidiary, effectively ending the UFC's Spike TV and Versus partnership. The deal includes 4 events on the main Fox network, 32 live Friday night fights per year on their cable network FX, 24 events following the Ultimate Fighter reality show and 6 separate Fight Night events. The promotion's first broadcast television event UFC on Fox, Velasquez vs. Dos Santos broke form by showcasing only one fight to television viewers. In the main event, Junior Dos Santos abruptly dethroned then undefeated UFC heavyweight champion Cain Velasquez by knockout at 104 in the first round. The telecast peaked with 8.8 million viewers tuning into the fight with an average audience of 5.7 million, making it by far the most-watched MMA event of all time and the most-watched combat sports event since 2003's HBO bout between Lennox Lewis and Vitaly Klitschko. The Ultimate Fighter changed formats and now be live and air on Friday nights on FX, followed by a live fight card. Many of the preliminary fights before UFC pay-per-views and UFC Unleashed programming will be on Fuel TV. Additional programming begins in January, including live fights, pre-shows and post-shows, countdown shows, UFC Ultimate Insider, UFC Unleashed, UFC Primetime, UFC Knockout Series, Best of Pride and Weigh-In specials. One of the other programming opportunities that is already in motion is a weekly UFC magazine-style show. When asked about the potential for a weekly magazine-style series, UFC CEO Lorenzo Fertitta responded, OE not only weekly, but, potentially, multiple times per week. Unregistered trademark LL have a UFC magazine. The UFC will maintain production control of its product, including the use of its broadcast team of Mike Goldberg and Joe Rogan. Fox Sports will produce the pre- and post-shows. Women's MMA. On November 16, 2012, the eve of UFC 154, St. Pierre vs. Condit, Dana White confirmed with Jim Rome the UFC will feature women's MMA with the signing of its first female fighter, Strikeforce bantamweight champion Ronda Rousey. She subsequently became the first female UFC champion, the first Olympic medalist with a UFC title, and the first woman to defend a UFC title. On December 11, 2013, the UFC picked up the contracts of 11 female fighters to fill up their 115-pound division. The strawweights will take part in the 20th season of The Ultimate Fighter. The season winner will be the first UFC Women unregistered trademark strawweight champion. Some of the fighters include Felice Herrig, Claudia Gadelha, Teshia Torres, Beck Hyatt, Joanne Calderwood, and even Invicta FC's strawweight champion Carla Esparza and many more. International expansion. In addition to the UFC PPV and the Ultimate Fighter events in the United States, UFC events have been held in 12 other countries. Puerto Rico, a United States territory, hosted UFC 6 in 1995. UFC Japan, Ultimate Japan was held in 1997, followed by UFC 23, Ultimate Japan 2 in 1999, UFC 25, Ultimate Japan 3 and UFC 29 in 2000. The promotion returned in 2012 with UFC 144, followed by UFC on Fuel TV, Silva vs. Stan in 2013. UFC Brazil, Ultimate Brazil was held in Sao Paulo in 1998. The promotion returned to Brazil in 2011 for UFC 134, and has hosted a total 12 events. UFC 38 was held in London, United Kingdom in 2002. UFC returned to the United Kingdom in 2007 with UFC 70, and has held a total 14 events there. UFC 93 was held in Ireland in 2009 as well. UFC has visited Canada 14 times, starting with UFC 83 in 2008. 5 UFC events have been held in Australia, beginning with UFC 110 in 2010. UFC 99 was held in Germany in 2009 and UFC 122 in 2010. UFC on Fuel TV, Gustafsson vs. Silva was held in Sweden in 2012, featuring local fighter Alexander Gustafsson, and UFC on Fuel TV, Mazacy vs. Latifi in 2013. UFC 112 was held in the United Arab Emirates in 2010, UFC on Fuel TV, Franklin vs. La in China in 2012, and UFC Fight Night, Safayeddin vs. Lim in Singapore in 2014. Most recently, UFC Fight Night, Kim vs. Hathaway was held in Macau, China in 2014. The Ultimate Fighter has had international editions as well, Brazil since 2012, China since 2013, and Canada vs. Australia in 2014. On September 16, 2012, CEO Lorenzo Fertitta announced that the UFC would be expanding the Ultimate Fighter to India, furthering international expansion. Because of mixed martial arts' relatively unknown status within India, and its population of 1.2 billion, Fertitta claimed that India would be a viable market to expand the UFC brand, however challenging. The UFC struck a deal with Sony 6 to produce the episodes and subsequently air them as well. Currently, filming is set to begin during the summer of 2013, and air later that fall. Additional events are planned for Brazil, Australia, China, Europe and the Middle East from 2014. Fighter pay. The pay in MMA has been criticized. The sport has been monopolized by the UFC, who take most of the revenue and put it back into the business, leaving fighters with a small percentage of the pay. The bonus structure has also been criticized, with one fighter calling it a means of control because they keep you guessing. The bonus structure has been used by Dana White as a way to manipulate the public's view on fighter pay, because whenever the topic comes up, the bonus structure is used as a defense, and he states you do not know the bonuses the fighters get. Rules. The current rules for the Ultimate Fighting Championship were originally established by the New Jersey Athletic Control Board. The set of unified rules of mixed martial arts that New Jersey established has been adopted in other states that regulate mixed martial arts, including Nevada, Louisiana, and California. These rules are also used by many other promotions within the United States, becoming mandatory for those states that have adopted the rules, and so have become the standard de facto set of rules for professional mixed martial arts across the country. Rounds. UFC matches vary in maximum length, depending on whether the match is for a championship title, or is a fight card's main event fight. In all fights, each round can be no longer than 5 minutes. Championship fights last for a maximum of 5 rounds. Beginning with UFC 138 on November 5, 2011, non-championship main event fights will also last for a maximum of 5 rounds. Non-main event bouts last for a maximum of 3 rounds. UFC on FX, Alves vs. Kampmann featured the organization's first 2 flyweight fights as part of its first flyweight tournament, which consists of bouts that, in the event of a draw, go to a 4th sudden victory round held to determine the winner, who advances. There is a 1-minute rest period between rounds. Weight divisions. The UFC currently uses 8 different weight classes. Non-title fights have a 1-pound leniency. In addition, there are 2 other weight classes specified in the unified rules which the UFC does not currently use: super heavyweight, unlimited, strawweight, cage. The UFC stages bouts in an 8-sided enclosure officially named the Octagon. Originally, SEG trademarked the concept as well as the term and prevented other mixed martial arts promotions from using the same type of cage. But in 2001 Zuffa gave permission for other promotions to use octagonal cages, reasoning that the young sport needed uniformity to continue to win official sanctioning. Today Zuffa reserves exclusive use of the name the Octagon. The UFC cage is an octagonal structure with walls of metal chain-link fence coated with black vinyl and a diameter of 32 ft, allowing 30 ft of space from point to point. The fence is 5 feet 6 into 5 feet 8 in height. The cage sits atop a platform, raising it 4 ft from the ground. It has foam padding around the top of the fence and between each of the 8 sections. It also has 2 entry-exit gates opposite each other. The mat, painted with sponsorship logos and art, is replaced for each event. Attire: all competitors must fight in approved shorts, without shoes. Shirts, jeans or long pants are not allowed. Fighters must use approved lightweight open-fingered gloves, that include at least 1 inch of padding around the knuckles, that allow fingers to grab. These gloves enable fighters to punch with less risk of an injured or broken hand, while retaining the ability to grab and grapple. A mouthguard and jock strap with protective cup are also required, and fighters are checked for these by a state athletic committee official before being allowed to enter the cage ring. Originally the attire for UFC was very open if controlled at all. Many fighters still chose to wear tight-fitting shorts or boxing-type trunks, while others wore long pants or singlets. Several wore wrestling shoes. Multi-time tournament champion Royce Gracie wore a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu GI in all his early appearances in UFC, while Art Jimerson appeared in UFC 1 wearing one standard boxing glove. As of UFC 133 there has been a ban on Speedo-style shorts after Dennis Hallman wore one in his fight against Brian Ebersol. UFC President Dana White was so furious about the fighter's choice of attire that he awarded an honorary "getting those horrifying shorts off TV as soon as possible" bonus to Ebersol for finishing the fight in the first round, and in following post-fight interviews made it clear that Speedo-style shorts will no longer be tolerated. Match outcome: matches may end via submission. A fighter clearly taps the mat or his opponent, verbally submits, or clearly communicates being in pain to a degree that causes the referee to stop the fight. Also, a technical submission may be called when a fighter either loses consciousness or is on the verge of serious injury while in a hold. Knockout: a fighter is put into a state of unconsciousness resulting from any legal strike. Technical knockout: if the referee decides a fighter cannot continue, the fight is ruled as a technical knockout. Technical knockouts can be classified into 3 categories: referee stoppage, doctor stoppage, corner stoppage. Judge's decision: Depending on scoring, a match may end as unanimous decision, majority decision, split decision, technical decision, unanimous draw, majority draw, split draw, technical draw. Disqualification: a fighter intentionally executes an illegal move that is considered by the referee or opponent to be injurious or significant enough to negatively alter the opponent's performance should the fight continue, resulting in the opponent's victory. Forfeit: a fighter fails to compete or intentionally and prematurely ends the bout for a reason besides injury, resulting in the opponent's victory. No contest: a fighter is rendered unable to continue or compete effectively as a result of an unintentional illegal element or move and there is not a sufficient number of finished rounds to be judged to make a technical decision viable, or both fighters are rendered unable to continue or compete effectively. Also, a fight may be ruled a no contest if the original outcome of the bout is changed due to unsatisfactory or illegal circumstances, such as a premature stoppage or a fighter's testing positive for banned substances. In the event of a draw, it is not necessary that the fighters' total points be equal. However, in a unanimous or split draw, each fighter does score an equal number of win judgments from the 3 judges. Judging criteria: the 10-point must system is in effect for all UFC fights. 3 judges score each round and the winner of each receives 10 points while the loser receives 9 points or fewer. Scores of 10 (8) are typically awarded for dominant rounds and anything more dominant is scored less. 10 (7) rounds are very rare. Fouls: the Nevada State Athletic Commission currently lists the following as fouls: biting, eye gouging, fish hooking, groin attacks, small joint manipulation, hair pulling, head butting, putting a finger into any orifice or into any cut or laceration on an opponent, striking to the spine or the back of the head, striking downward using the point of the elbow, throat strikes of any kind, including, without limitation, grabbing the trachea, clawing, pinching or twisting the flesh, grabbing the clavicle, intentionally attempting to break an opponent's bone, kicking the head of a grounded opponent, kneeing the head of a grounded opponent, stomping a grounded opponent, kicking to the kidney with the heel, spiking an opponent at the canvas on his head or neck, throwing an opponent out of the ring or fenced area, holding the shorts or gloves of an opponent, spitting at an opponent, engaging in unsportsmanlike conduct that causes an injury to an opponent, holding the ropes or the fence, using abusive language in the ring or fenced area, attacking an opponent on or during the break, attacking an opponent who is under the care of the referee, attacking an opponent after the bell has sounded the end of a round, flagrantly disregarding the instructions of the referee, timidity, including, without limitation, avoiding contact with an opponent, intentionally or consistently dropping the mouthpiece or faking an injury, interference by the corner. When a foul is charged, the referee in their discretion may deduct 1 or more points as a penalty. If a foul incapacitates a fighter, then the match may end in a disqualification if the foul was intentional, or a no contest if unintentional. If a foul causes a fighter to be unable to continue later in the bout, it ends with a technical decision win to the injured fighter if the injured fighter is ahead on points, otherwise it is a technical draw. Match conduct: after a verbal warning the referee can stop the fighters and stand them up if they reach a stalemate on the ground. This rule is codified in Nevada as the stand-up rule. If the referee pauses the match, it is resumed with the fighters in their prior positions. Grabbing the cage brings a verbal warning, followed by an attempt by the referee to release the grab by pulling on the grabbing hand. If that attempt fails or if the fighter continues to hold the cage, the referee may charge a foul. Early UFC events disregarded verbal sparring/trash-talking during matches. Under unified rules, antics are permitted before events to add to excitement and allow fighters to express themselves, but abusive language during combat is prohibited. Evolution of the rules: UFC 1 Although the advertising said there are no rules, there were in fact some rules: no biting, no eye gouging and no groin attacks. Fights ended only in the event of a knockout, submission or the corner throwing in the towel. Despite this, the first match in UFC 1 was won by referee stoppage, even though it was not officially recognized as such at the time. UFC 2 groin attacks were unbanned. Time limits were dropped ending the need for judges. Modifications to the cage were added. UFC 3 Euro The referee was officially given the authority to stop a fight in case of a fighter being unable to defend himself. A fighter could not kick if he was wearing shoes. This rule would later be discarded, then changed to no kicking with shoes while on the ground and then reinstated, before finally being discarded. UFC 4 Euro After tournament alternate Steve Jenem won UFC 3 by winning only one bout. Alternates were required to win a pre-tournament bout to qualify for the role of an alternate. UFC 5 Euro The organizers introduced a 30-minute time limit. UFC 5 also saw the first super fight, a one-off bout between two competitors selected by the organizers, with the winner being crowned super fight champion and having the duty of defending his title at the next UFC. UFC 6 Euro The referee was given the authority to restart the fight. If two fighters were entangled in a position where there was a lack of action, the referee could stop the fight and restart the competitors on their feet, in their own corner. In UFC 6 they officially adopted the 5-minute extension to the 30-minute rule which had been used in UFC 5. Ultimate 1995 Euro This event was the first to introduce the no-fish hooking rule and to reinstate judges. Time limits were changed to 15 minutes in the quarterfinals, 18 minutes in the semi-finals and 27 minutes in the finals. UFC 8 Euro time limits changed to 10 minutes in the first two rounds of the tournament, 15 minutes in the tournament final and super fight. Time limits would continually change in the later UFC events. Fights could now be decided by a judge's decision if the fight reached the end of the time limit. The panel was made up of 3 judges who simply raised a card with the name of the fighter they considered to be the winner. In this fashion, a draw was not possible since the only 2 possible outcomes of a decision were 3-0 or 2-1 in favor of the winner. UFC 9 Euro To appease local authorities, closed-fisted strikes to the head were banned for this event only. The commentators were not aware of this last-minute rule that was made to prevent the cancellation of the event due to local political pressures. Referee Big John McCarthy made repeated warnings to the fighters to open the hand, when this rule was violated. However, not one fighter was reprimanded. UFC 9 was also the last UFC event to feature the super fight. Ultimate 1996 Euro This event was the first to introduce the no grabbing of the fence rule. UFC 12 Euro The main tournament split into a heavyweight and lightweight division. And the 8-man tournament ceased. Fighters now needed to win only 2 fights to win the competition. The heavyweight champion title was introduced, replacing the super fight title. UFC 14 Euro The lightweight division was rebranded middleweight. The wearing of padded gloves, weighing 110 to 170 kg, becomes mandatory. Gloves were to be approved by the UFC. Hair pulling, groin strikes and kicks to a downed opponent became illegal. UFC 15 Euro limits on permissible striking areas were introduced. Headbutts, elbow strikes to the back of the neck and head and small joint manipulation became illegal. UFC 21 Euro 5-minute rounds were introduced, with preliminary bouts consisting of 2 rounds, regular non-title bouts at 3 rounds, and title bouts at 5 rounds. The 10-point must system was introduced for scoring fights. UFC 28 Euro The New Jersey State Athletic Control Board sanctions its first UFC event, using the newly developed unified rules of mixed martial arts. Major changes to the UFC's rules included barring knee strikes to the head of a downed opponent, elbow strikes to the spine and neck and punches to the back of the neck and head. Limits on permissible ring attire, stringent medical requirements, and regulatory oversight were also introduced. A new weight class system was also introduced. This new set of rules is currently the de facto standard for MMA events held in the US and is still in use by the UFC. UFC 31 Euro weight classes are realigned to the current standard. Bantamweight moves from 150 to 155 and becomes known as lightweight. Lightweight becomes known as welterweight, middleweight becomes light heavyweight, and a new middleweight class is introduced at 185 pounds. UFC 43 Euro In the event of a stoppage fight's restart in the position the fight was stopped. UFC 94 Euro. After an incident where Georges St-Pierre was accused of putting Vaseline on his back, cornermen were disallowed from bringing Vaseline into the octagon. Lubricant may now only be applied outside the octagon before the commencement of the first round. UFC 97 Euro. Foot stomps are banned. UFC 98 Euro. Foot stomps are allowed again. UFC 133 Euro. Speedo-style trunks are banned. UFC 138 Euro. First 5-round non-title main event. The Ultimate Fighter. Fights that occur on The Ultimate Fighter are classified as exhibition matches under NSAC sanctioning, and thus do not count toward the professional record of a fighter. Match outcomes also do not need to be immediately posted publicly, which allows for fight results to be unveiled as the series progresses. These exhibition matches variably have 2 or 3 rounds, depending on the rules used for each season. In most seasons, preliminary matches were 2 rounds. In Season 2, all matches had 3 rounds. For 2-round matches, if there is a draw after 2 rounds, an extra 5-minute round is contested. If the extra round concludes without a stoppage, the judge's decision will be based on that final round. All matches past the first round use 3 rounds as per standard UFC bouts. During the finales for each series, the division finals have the standard 3 rounds, plus a 4th round if the judges score a tie. UFC events. Production team. Comedian, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Taekwondo black belt Joe Rogan teams up with play-by-play announcer Mike Goldberg to provide commentary during broadcasts of nearly all UFC events. The veteran voice of the Octagon is announcer Bruce Buffer. Ariane Celeste and Brittany Palmer are Octagon girls. Each fighter is assigned a cutman by the promotion who cares for the fighter before the fight and in between rounds. Jacob Stitch Duran is one of the best-known cutmen working for the organization. Matches are made by matchmaker, and VP of Talent Relations, Joe Silva. Burt Watson is the production manager for all UFC events, including fighter weigh-ins and other public events held before fights that frequently draw crowds of fans and reporters. Fighter salaries and contracts. A UFC fighter generally does not have a salary. They are paid per fight, with amounts depending on how well known the fighters are and how well sponsored a fighter and an event is. Fighters will typically get paid money to fight with an additional bonus if they win. Cash bonuses are also awarded for Fight of the Night, and Performance of the Night. The size of these bonuses are $50,000 USD, and, for less well-known fighters, they can be several times larger than the contracted amount for the fight. Contracted amounts generally have to be declared to the State Athletic Commission. However, the UFC also pays undisclosed locker room bonuses to fighters. In recent years, UFC fighters' contracts and merchandising rights have been the subject of dispute between fighters and UFC, which has attempted to defend existing regulations. Current champions. Male, female, UFC Hall of Fame, AA, are the only non-fighter inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. AB, are the only fighter who was not a UFC champion to be inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. Media, music, UFC, Ultimate Beatdowns, Volume 1, an album of music featured in and inspired by the UFC. Video games, Ultimate Fighting Championship, UFC, Tap Out, UFC, Throwdown, UFC, Tap Out 2, UFC, Sudden Impact, UFC 2009 Undisputed, UFC Undisputed 2010, UFC Personal Trainer, UFC Undisputed 3, EA Sports UFC. In January 2007, Zuffa and video game developer publisher THQ announced a license agreement giving THQ worldwide rights to develop titles under the UFC brand. The agreement gives THQ exclusive rights to current and next-generation consoles as well as to PC and handheld titles. Also included are certain wireless rights, which were not detailed. The licensing agreement was set to expire in 2011, although it appeared to have been extended to 2017. On June 6, 2012, during the E3 exhibition, THQ had announced that they will be giving the license of UFC Undisputed to EA. The move came about months after UFC Undisputed 3's release, which THQ felt did not make a profit for the company. UFC 4 will feature fighters from Strikeforce. Action figures, Round 5. The first UFC action figure collectibles were released by Round 5 Corporation in May 2008. Series 1 of their figures includes Quinton Rampage Jackson, Matt Hughes, Tito Ortiz, and Randy Couture. Series 2 includes Wanderlei Silva, Sean Sherk, Rich Franklin, and Anderson Silva. In July 2009, Round 5 acquired the UFC license through Jakks Pacific and subsequently released 5 more series under the UFC and Pride brands. 2 packs were released in August 2010 and includes a UFC octagon cage and Pride ring display stand. Limited edition versions include fabric walkout tees or paint variations and are limited in number with foil and holographic packaging variances. Special edition and exclusive versions have been released at various UFC Fan Expo events. Jakks Pacific. On June 10, 2008, it was announced that UFC had signed an exclusive 4-year contract with Jakks Pacific to create action figures for UFC. As of 2009, the schedule envisages the release of these figures in November 2009. They have currently been 8 series released and they feature special Legends, Pride, and WEC-style figures as well. 3 2-pack series have also been released, as well as several Expo and Internet exclusives. There are also several different Octagon cage playsets that have been released, including the Octagon Playset, Official Scale Octagon Playset, and Electronic Reaction Octagon Playset. A Pride-style ring playset was also originally planned, however no news have been given on its status or release date since then. Jakks Pacific UFC Deluxe Figure Lineups, Series 0, Royce Gracie, Brock Lesnar, Frank Mir, Rashad Evans, Keith Jardine, Houston Alexander, Kendall Grove, and Miguel Angel Torres. Series 1, Chuck Liddell, Anderson Silva, Forrest Griffin, Michael Bisping, Evan Tanner, Kevin Randleman, Sheik Kongo, and Mike Swick. Series 2, Nate Marquardt, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, Mike Thomas Brown, Baz Rutten, Georges Street Pierre, Lyoto Machida, Quinton Jackson, and Thiago Alves. Series 3, Chuck Liddell, Karo Parian, B.J. Penn, John Fitch, Mark Coleman, Thiago Silva, and Morikawa Rua. Series 4, Wanderlei Silva, Sean Sherk, Rich Franklin, Matt Hughes, Kimbo Slice, Jamie Varner, Don Frye, and Andrei Arlovsky. Series 5, Lyoto Machida, Quinton Jackson, Matt Hamill, Dan Severn, Kenny Florian, Matt Serra, and Stephan Bonner. Series 6, Thiago Alves, Randy Couture, Georges Street Pierre, Clay Guida, Frank Mir, Tito Ortiz, Jens Pulver, and Baz Rutten. Series 7, B.J. Penn, Anderson Silva, Andrei Arlovsky, Forrest Griffin, Diego Sanchez, and Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. Series 8, Matt Hughes, Chuck Liddell, Frankie Edgar, Nate Diaz, and Quinton Jackson. Jakks Pacific UFC Deluxe 2-packs Figures Lineups, Series 1, Chuck Liddell vs Wanderlei Silva, Frank Mir vs Brock Lesnar, Anderson Silva vs Rich Franklin. Series 2, Lyoto Machida vs Shogun Rua, Georges Street Pierre vs Matt Hughes, Randy Couture vs Chuck Liddell. Series 3, Chuck Liddell vs Tito Ortiz, B.J. Penn vs Kenny Florian, Dan Severn vs Royce Gracie. Expos exclusives, Georges Street Pierre, Ringside Collectibles Internet exclusives, Forrest Griffin vs Stephan Bonner, The Ultimate Fighter Season 1 Final, Dana White, Quinton Rampage Jackson 1 of 1000, DVD. Every pay-per-view UFC event has been released onto DVD. UFC 23 through UFC 29 were not released in the US on home video or DVD by SEG. They have since been released onto box sets which feature around 10 events each set, in chronological order. XBOX Live, UFC on XBOX Live launched on December 20, 2011. XBOX Live subscribers are able to view pay-per-view events in high definition, access a library of live and on-demand video content, connect with friends to predict fight results and have the ability to compare fighter statistics and records. Other functions are also available. Free fights have recently been streamed for a limited time. See also: List of UFC champions, List of UFC events, List of current UFC fighters, List of UFC bonus award recipients, List of current mixed martial arts champions. References. External links: Official website, Ultimate Fighting Championship on Twitter, MMA Fight Cages.